we just want to thank you for, for coming. And the foundation was established in 1990 to serve as a partner with the Conservation Board for Public Education and Natural Resource Conservation Project. So we're the 501c3 group that helps provide funds for projects, exhibits, special programming, all that kind of fun stuff. So we try to do lots of great things. We have 10 board members on our board of directors that serve 3-year terms and rotate. Brian Hazlitt is our president. Myself, let's see, Rich Pope, is there in the back. Ann Shaner, she will not be here today. Chris Jackson is here with us. Christine Zilmerzant, who also serves on our conservation board. Robert Meese. Norb Ruland, I don't believe he's here yet. Rod Tondrew, and then we do have a vacancy. John Helms served last year until he moved to Vermont. Our mission, the foundation mission, is threefold. We like stewardship of the land and managing critical Les Hills prairies and native plants, especially within the Les Hills, including our county parks. We like to promote environmental education and awareness of natural resource conservation. And of course, originally helped establish and also supports the Dorothy Pico Nature Center. They also sponsor our Nature Calls fundraiser, annual fundraiser, which is a beer and wine tasting, nature, art, and charity auction to raise funds for educational programming, seasonal staff, and exhibits. You can save the date for September 21st, 24. Some of our notable things that the Foundation and the Conservation Board did last year in 2023 is we did receive a couple of grants that helped with these projects. The BNSF Railway gave to our outdoor learning shelter. In 22, we also received a MERD grant and a large bequest so that we can have this. The Siouxland Big Give and the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation through the State Parks grant program helped raise funds for new features that will go into the playscape this year or replace the spider web that is a little worn out. And we also received the Gilchrist Foundation for the prairie route display that is connected with our prairie diorama out here, and then of course the Screech Owl Lucia's tree, her little aviary tree. You can find all of us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, our website, and of course if you want to learn more. So we thank you. We do rely on memberships. That helps us accomplish all of these great things along with those grants and fundraising. So if you are interested, I do have some membership forms up there. I know a lot of you are members, so thank you for supporting us, and we really appreciate that. And a lot of those things go towards prairie restoration, summer day camp scholarships, funding summer naturalists, and lots of other fun, great things at the Nature Center and in our county parks. So now I'd like to welcome Dan Fogell to come on up with our Snakes on the Plains.
There wasn't this many people when I came in here. What happened?
It's a people invasion.
They're hiding in the back. Is this on the laptop?
Yes, it is.
I'm going to grab this because my entire life is on this.
Great.
I'm running without
We're
it.
going to go ahead. Is that a little better? You can see that?
I'll get there. All right. So what I was initially asked to do was to come talk about like the snakes of Iowa. And I'm not going to lie to you, I love snakes, but the snakes of Iowa, the snakes of Nebraska, the snakes of anything, is just a boring talk. It's like, here's a picture of this snake. Here's what this snake looks like. Here's what this snake does. What I'd rather do is talk to you about how the snakes that live in grasslands, what we call the interior plains, which includes Iowa, Nebraska, and points to the east, how they have evolved and adapted to the miserable conditions that exist on the plains. Can we all agree that the conditions here, as much as we might love it, are kind of miserable? Temperature extremes, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to talk a little bit about that stuff. In case you want to know where the plains are, before I moved here, I referred to anything that had grass as the Great Plains, but it turns out that is not true. The Great Plains include, or the interior plains include the Great Plains, which you can see outlined here, the central lowlands, which Iowa is included in, which I consider the good plains, not the Great Plains, but the good plains, and then the interior low plateau, which is the okay plains, right? Yeah, we can stay where they belong. All right. So this includes most of the grasslands in the central part of the country. And we're not the only continent or the only country that has this great big giant grasslands in the center of it. Asia's got one, South America has one, and it turns out that the animals that evolved in those places all evolved in very similar fashion, in very similar ways, because it's miserable there too, not just here. All right, so what are they? They're grasslands, and they start from west to east, just outside of the Rocky Mountains, with short grass prairie that, a few inches tall. And then that graduates into mixed grass prairie, which graduates into tall grass prairie, which starts to introduce a few trees, and we get to some savanna, mostly oak savanna, but some savanna. Lots of strong winds, lots of violent storms, and we'll talk about climate right now. The official name for the climate in the Central Plains, in the middle of this country, is continental climate. Lots of daily and seasonal extremes in terms of temperature differences, extremely cold winters, extremely hot summers. I looked up some data just to see where some of this stuff actually happens. And in York, Nebraska, November 29th and 30th, the temperature went from 81 degrees Fahrenheit on the 29th down to 10 degrees Fahrenheit on the 30th. In less than like 16 hours. So that's a 71-degree drop. Now, to survive in this, you've got to be a pretty strong, I was going to say badass, I'm going to say it anyway, pretty badass animal, right? To survive in this kind of stuff. We have lots of extreme storms, floods, snowfalls, and they're becoming even more common. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Obviously, temperatures increase from north to south, and you can see that on the upper map there. And then precipitation increases from west to east. The Rocky Mountain rain shadow has a reach that makes it almost to the western edge of Iowa. And that rain shadow causes very dry, almost desert-like conditions where the short grass prairie is. And then as you make your way towards the tall grass prairie, there's enough moisture to support trees and a little bit taller vegetation. All right, let's talk about reptiles for a change. The latitudinal diversity gradient, and in terms of reptile species richness, so this map just gives you an idea of how rich the species are of reptiles from north to south and from west to east or east to west in the United States. Diversity increases when you go from north to south, so the higher latitudes to the lower latitudes, it gets higher, the increase in richness, or low to high if you want to go from the south to north. But in terms of longitudinal gradients, there's really not a longitudinal gradient in terms of species richness, species types, because of different adaptations, being more dry to the west and more wet to the east. And most of those dry-loving, arid-loving species disappear as you go east, and then they're replaced by more wet-loving species. And you can see if you overlay the plains map, there really is no effect of the plains on the species richness, either from north to south or from east to west. So what is it that animals have to deal with in order to survive from day to day? These are the threats, or these are the factors that affect their success, right? What we're ultimately going to call their fitness, their ability to survive and to reproduce. All of these things. And we're going to look at a few of them and look at some of the adaptations that snakes and a few other kinds of herpetofauna have and use in order to survive in this environment. Let me start off by saying that plains herpetofauna, like the word I used earlier, badass, are like Top Gun fighter pilots. They are the best of the best. And I'll give you some examples in a little bit why they're the best of the best. Natural selection in the land of extremes means that if you're still here, you have survived some serious crap, right? Some very serious stuff, if you're still existing on the plains today. If you're not here today, I'm talking about the species, right? If you're not here today, then you cannot deal with the day-to-day, season-to-season extremes that come with living on the plains. Just a few other things that you see here: extreme cold, extreme heat, very unpredictable weather shifts that happen throughout the days, throughout the months, throughout the seasons, throughout the years, drought, flood, fire, etc. Things that we're used to from day to day, from season to season, things that, well, you know, I don't know if you guys know this, but whenever, I'm sure you've recognized this, if you watch the national news, whenever it snows in New York or New England, the whole world's in an uproar, right? Like, oh, New York got 12 inches of snow, 14 inches of snow in New York City. Meanwhile, we're sitting here in 2 feet of snow and not a word about it. Like, oh, it's just the plains, it happens all the time. So this is what we deal with. The species that live, and not just the herpetofauna, but all the species that exist on the plains, have been selected for extreme conditions, right? Meaning that they can deal with this, and we'll talk about some of the specific things. Why do animals live? Why do humans live? Reproduction and preparing for reproduction, right? So this is Darwin/Wallace's fitness description. To survive and reproduce. This is the reason for existence for almost every living thing. Reproduction takes some energy. Gametogenesis, producing gametes, producing eggs and sperm. Finding a mate, which is very risky. Looking, searching for one, calling for one, fighting off competition for one, actual mating, maintaining pregnancy for the girls, finding a birthing site, etc. All of this requires energy, and so the rest of the season is spent preparing for reproduction, eating, and then building up energy reserves for reproduction. The problem here in the plains is that they also have to find a way to get out of extreme temperatures and other extreme conditions. All right, let's talk about ectotherms. I'm going to grab some water. I have a, it's not because of drinking, just a wicked dry mouth. Some information about ectotherms. First of all, we don't call them cold-blooded anymore, right? Even herpetology has become politically correct. We call them ectotherms. They are dependent on outside temperatures for their body temperature. They can't generate their own heat like we can. So whatever the temperature is outside, that's their body temperature. And if it gets too cool for them, then they have to move to a place to get warm, or if it gets too hot, they have to move to a place that's cool. So it includes amphibians and what we're now going to refer to as non-avian reptiles. Are there any birders in the room? All right, so you know that birds are now reptiles? You're welcome. But they are avian reptiles. I like the non-avian reptiles. Endotherms, like yourself and like mammals and like birds, generate heat. That takes a lot of energy. It's the reason that mammals and birds have to eat a lot, is because it takes a whole bunch of energy to generate that heat and maintain your body temperature at 98.6 degrees, or whatever the body temperature is for your favorite bird. Ectotherms have an advantage. They don't have to waste any energy on getting warm. Right? They don't have to generate their own body heat, which means when they eat something, all of that, most of that, more than 60% of what they eat, is going to go to growth. It's going to go to reproduction. It's going to go to everything else except wasting energy on developing body heat, on forming body heat. Right? It's one of the reasons that snakes and frogs and whatever can grow so quickly in just a couple of years. It's also one of the reasons they don't have to eat very often. Right? So when it's extremely cold out, like today, ectotherms reduce their metabolic activities, meaning they're not spending any energy on anything. Right? The temperature is forcing them to not do anything. We'll come up with a definition for that in a minute here. this comes with disadvantages. That means that when it does get cold in the plains and any other place in the northern hemisphere where there's a winter, they have to escape the cold. They also, in the summertime, have to escape the heat. And we'll see how they have adapted to these conditions as well. Sometimes this has to happen all in one day. Like, granted, the example that I gave you was in November, but this still happens throughout the season. Look at March on this map. Again, this is in central Nebraska, but it's still part of the plains. The month of March, there was 100, if you look at the record high and the record low, meaning that it could get this warm again and it could get this cold again, was a 115-degree difference. Find me another place in the United States where you see this big difference in a day. You're not. If this was in New York, it would be all over all the news channels. But it's not going to happen there, right? So this is the stuff that they have to cope with and have had to cope with for tens of thousands of generations. So what do? Well, because it's cold, mobility is reduced. They can't move, they can't search for food, they can't capture food, there's no food anyway, because all the food is gone and hiding. More importantly, they can't escape from predators, which means that if you were a badger, a warm-blooded, nice and toasty badger, and wanted to eat a rattlesnake, then in the middle of the wintertime, you could just pick it up and eat it without fear of being bitten by the rattlesnake, because they can't move, they can't even defend themselves. Their body fluids will freeze, and then ultimately they would die. So what are some of their adaptations? Well, obviously, a tropical vacation is not one, though that looks like a heck of a party, right? I'd go to that beach. Or staycation. Well, the staycation is the option that they're going to go with. They don't know from October, from November. They don't use calendars, they can't read. But they do get cues from the environment. One of the cues is it starts to get cold, but then it doesn't, and then it does, and then it doesn't, and then it does, right? We know this. I don't know what the temps were here a couple of weeks ago, but we had high 60-degree temps down in Omaha and Lincoln last week. Last night it was 7. So it gets cold, warm, gets cold, gets warm. They have to decide at what point do they go down underground or do they hide away from the elements for a while, for the whole season. So a photoperiod comes into play here. Regardless of the temperature, the photoperiod is always going to get shorter and shorter and shorter as we move towards winter. Also, there are some endogenous cues. As the photoperiod changes, it causes changes to hormones inside of their bodies, and then these hormones take over and tell them, all right, even though it looks like it's nice outside, it's not going to last, so get underground. Vocab, right? Quiz time. Now we'll quiz you later. A couple of words that you may not have ever heard of. So I'm sure you've heard of dormancy. This is a period when growth, development, physical activity in an animal stop, shut down for whatever reason. Sometimes this can happen on a daily basis. Hummingbirds do this with torpor, something called torpor. We're not going to talk about torpor here, but hibernation and brumation. These are two words that are very similar to each other, but they apply to two different groups of animals. Hibernation is that state of dormancy in endotherms that's characterized by low body temperature, low, slowed down breathing, slowed down heart rate, and a low metabolic rate, and sleep. Most importantly, sleep. The drop in body temperature is controlled by the animal itself. It will tell itself to drop its body temperature. Whereas brumation is, same definition, state of dormancy in ectotherms that's characterized by low body temperature, slow breathing, slow heart rate, low metabolic rate, but no sleep. In this case, brumation, a drop in body temperature is obligatory. It has no choice to drop its body temperature because the temperature outside in its environment is dropping. And so it has to comply. So the difference between hibernation and brumation is endotherms versus ectotherms. Ectotherms have no choice. They don't go to sleep because they have to. They don't go to sleep at all. They just drop. They stop doing everything because they don't have the energy to keep moving. And then there's estivation. This is, so we'll call it kind of the opposite of hibernation. A state of dormancy that's induced by very hot, very dry conditions, summer times. What are we going to use here? I'm not going to make you learn brumation. We're going to stick with hibernation because it's a word everybody knows, right? If you want to be snobby and use the word brumation, you certainly can, like we do, right? But we're just going to use hibernation for this talk when we talk about this stuff. So 3 rules of hibernation: don't freeze, make sure you have oxygen, and make sure something doesn't eat you while you're in hibernation, especially if you're an ectotherm. Amphibians have it very easy. They have the ability to breathe through their skin. So they can go underwater, they can bury themselves in the muck at the bottom of a pond and just sit there. If you can find a place that has nice clear ice, you can probably look and see a bunch of frogs just all sleeping in the muck, in the benthos, at the bottom of a pond. Toads will bury themselves. They don't necessarily go in the water, but they kind of bury themselves in wet soil for an entire season. Salamanders will either dig their own burrows or will use burrows dug by other animals. They use crayfish burrows. In the western part of the plains where there are prairie dogs, they use prairie dog burrows. They go inside of dog burrows and they just spend the winter or the summer in there. And then there are these weird frogs that use something called cryoprotection. So there's a word that you should take with you today. Cryoprotection. They have the ability to produce their own antifreeze. What's that?
Oh, I was telling him to be quiet so he didn't hear it.
They can produce their own antifreeze, right? Not the kind you drink and die from, but their own. So they produce something called urea, and they produce something that's similar to glycogen. And they accumulate all of this, and what it does is it prevents their body cells and their body's tissues from freezing. So they can just get underneath the grass and just sit there for a while. The frogs that you can find, like this wood frog right up here, which is found on the grass, completely encrusted in snow and ice, warm him up and he'll be just fine. He'll hop away. You bring home a tree frog from around here. Now, don't do this, but you could. Bring a tree frog home, put it in your freezer for a few days, and then take it back out, and it'll just hop away. Right? Kind of cool that they can do that. So this is their way of coping. These are some adaptations that amphibians on the plains have figured out how to get out of cold and or warm weather. Aquatic turtles also hibernate in ponds. When they get under the water, they go into the benthos, into the muck, and they just sit there and spend the whole winter there. If it gets warm enough, you'll see 1, maybe 10, maybe 1,000 sitting on some logs warming up, but then they'll just go right back in the water and right back into the muck. Some of them will use wet ditches on the side of the road, like that snapping turtle did, with an entire mound of soil and grass on top of him. When he came out of hibernation, that's what was on top of him. Box turtles have the ability to dig their own burrows because they're terrestrial. So there's a box turtle burrow with a little welcome mat, and they also have a cryoprotectant, very similar to what the frogs use to keep them from freezing to death in the wintertime. Nobody's going to ask?
Please tell us.
All right. Turtles, cloacal bursae, are an extension of the turtle's bladder. Right? It's an organ that's located. Do you know what a cloaca is?
No.
So do you know what a butt is? So it's like a butt, but it's not just for poop. It's for everything that comes out of the turtle. Right? Eggs, poop, pee. Inside of that little region is a series of blood vessels that can actually swap gases for the turtle. So turtles can breathe through their butts. Right? Now I've tried over and over and over again and I can't seem to get it done, so I must not have a bursae. But turtles have cloacal bursae, which allow them to exchange gases while they're underwater without having to worry about breathing, inhaling and exhaling and whatever. So it's kind of like what the frogs do with cutaneous respiration, but butt respiration. Lizards and snakes, the terrestrial reptiles, have to work a little bit harder to get through these rough times. They don't have that porous skin like amphibians do, and they can't breathe through their butts like turtles do. So you would have figured it out eventually in the next slide. They still have to get oxygen. But in order to survive winter and, again, hot summer conditions, they've got to be a little bit more selective about where they go so that they can get the ability to still breathe, so that they can have the ability to escape predation. Very, very important to them. Some of them are self-sufficient, can actually dig themselves underground. But most of them depend on other animals to provide them with a way to get underground, both, again, in the summer and in the wintertime. Lizards, like this northern prairie, or this prairie lizard right here, have the ability to dig their own holes. And they do this when it's too cold and when it's too hot. And they'll get underground and they'll just hang out until the conditions are right to come back out again. This race runner will do the same thing. And that hole right there was a hole that a race runner was using. I just sat and watched them go in and out and in and out and in and out, trying to get me to leave. And I'm like, nope, not gonna leave. Skinks, like this Great Plains skink and this northern prairie skink right here, will just get underneath the big rock and stay under the rock. The rock will stay moist. Well, under the rock, the soil will stay moist. Nobody should move it, right? It should stay put, and so they should be relatively safe from predation. Snakes, however, really have to work hard. They are the hardest workers when it comes for a place to stay in the extreme cold and in the extreme heat. First of all, they really suck at digging. There are a couple of exceptions I'll talk about, but for the most part, I mean, try to dig a hole without using your arms and legs. Think you can do it? I can't even eat without using my arms and legs. Imagine trying to dig a hole.
Wait, how can you do it?
What's that?
How can you do it?
Oh, I don't want to show you. It's not a pretty picture. And most snakes are larger than lizards, and so they need a lot more space than a tiny little lizard does to survive hot and cold conditions. They're opportunists. If they find a hole and that hole seems to be unoccupied by a predator, they'll just use that hole. When they do this, they run the risk of that hole being not deep enough to get away from the elements, right? So here is where adaptation comes in handy. When snakes get into holes and try to get away from the cold, if it's not deep enough, what happens? They die. They freeze and they die, right? Now, what happens to those stupid genes that that snake is carrying around inside its DNA? They die with it. So the stupid snakes that pick the stupid places to hibernate are going to be gone. And over lots of generations of evolutionary time, this has happened. And so most of these snakes know instinctively, genetically, where to not go versus where to go. Okay? So a hole is not just a hole, it's not just a hole. But we're going to call it just a hole for now.
Okay.
Many snakes are communal hibernators, where they will find one, if you find one good hole, everybody moves in, the whole family, the extended family. People you didn't even know. It's like when you win the lottery and you hear from people, you're like, I haven't heard from you in 2,000 years, but I'm going to come hang out with you. So one snake finds a good place that it uses a scent trail, and all the rest of the snakes follow that scent trail, and then they all use the same place. And then, because it's so good, they come back the next year, and the next year, and the next year, and for thousands of years. So they just keep coming back. And sometimes it's not just the one species, like where the rattlesnakes are up here in northwest Iowa. It's not just the rattlesnakes, there are bull snakes, there are racers, there are fox snakes that are all using the same holes that the rattlesnakes are using. Here are your Great Plains digger snakes. They can make their own holes, and they do so usually in the summertime when it's too hot more than anything else, and they want to estivate, they want to get underneath the sand and cool off. Bull snakes and their relatives, and then hognose snakes. And this is a bull snake, and you can see the big scale on its nose. Is there a pointer on this?
Should be. Find it?
Really? Oh. Okay. Right. So you can see this great big nose scale right here. It's called a rostral scale. One of the ways you can tell something is a bull snake versus something else is that that rostral scale is going to be twice as high as it is wide. If you ever read the key for how to identify a species of snake, that's one of the first things you're going to see is rostral scale, twice as high as it is wide. And that identifies it as a bull snake or a pine snake or something closely related to it. The hognose snake has a shovel built into its nose. Right? So that's a western hognose snake, and I brought an eastern hognose snake with me today so you can kind of see his as well. And this thing just puts its nose down in the sand, moves the sand out of the way, and creates himself a nice little burrow, and then he'll crawl inside. Now, would he rather use somebody else's burrow instead of digging his own? Sure, it's a lot of energy to dig your own. But if it comes right down to it, he'll build his own. Now, prairie dogs. the snake's friend. And not just prairie dogs, voles, gophers, anything that builds a hole or starts building a hole is the friend of the snake, because the snakes will use those holes. Even crayfish will use will dig holes that snakes will use. This is a prairie rattlesnake moving across a prairie dog town. Prairie dog's a little nervous. They know that he's not going to hurt them, but still, they're a little nervous, as I think we all would be. Not me, but you guys. This is a garter snake coming up out of one of those holes that was built by one of those lizards. Probably ate the lizards too. This is a Massasauga rattlesnake, and he's popping his head out of a hole that's just like this. This is a crayfish burrow that a prairie crayfish has dug. It's not in the water, it's just outside of the water. And it's close enough to the water that there's a water level underneath. Water is in this hole. And in the wintertime, these Massasaugas will go in that hole, get into the water, turn around and have their head sitting just above the water while the rest of their bodies are in the water. And what that does, because that water is not going to freeze, then they are not going to freeze. And how do they know it's time to come up from hibernation? When that water level starts to rise because of all the melting snow, then it's time for them to come out. So they get a little cue from hiding out with the crayfishes. All right, these are the best places for snakes. You want a south or a southwest facing rocky ledge with a great big hole that they can get them and all of their family into. And again, not just rattlesnakes, bull snakes, racers, coach whips, anything that lives on the grass. They come out in the spring, they travel all over the place, they find food, they get ready for reproduction, they put on some fat reserves, and then they come back into their hole, the same hole they came out of, every single year.
Even pythons?
No, I wish there were pythons here,
Pythons are like...
unfortunately. Gotta go to Florida for one of those, or Asia, which is where they're supposed to be.
So you're saying a python?
What's that?
Python could fit in that hole?
Oh yeah, python can fit in that hole. A couple of pythons can fit in that hole. Right? So nice big holes like that for lots of snakes. And you're going to find, if you find something like this that's holding snakes, you'll know. You could show up on a warm April day, and it doesn't matter where you walk, you're going to step over a snake. They all use the same habitat. They can also use small holes. Like it doesn't have to be a great big giant hole. As long as you can get deep enough into the rocks or deep enough into the soil, then it will stay warm all winter long, like this timber rattlesnake right here, right? So this timber rattlesnake came out of this hole, and there's probably a couple more in there, but not that many, right? A few, but not that many. All right, and in a pinch, a hole is a hole is a hole, right? So to speak. You may not get a lot of animals using these holes, a lot of snakes using these holes, but one or two can fit in there, and one or two will probably survive the winter in there. All right, moving on. Estivation, hibernation for summertime. When it gets hot, when it gets dry. Sadly, amphibians, they're like functionless when it's dry. They need to have a little bit of moisture to keep their skin moist. So they go into burrows. They can dig their own. In fact, the salamanders around here are in a family known as the mole salamanders, because they can dig their own holes and get underground. And this is a tiger salamander that's entering into a burrow because it's too hot, and it's going to stay there until it either rains or it gets cool. There are some frogs, some amphibians, that will only be out in the spring when it rains, like May, April, May. They'll come out, they'll breed, then they'll go back on the ground, and you won't see them again until the next year. And if it doesn't rain the next year, you won't see them that year. Sometimes they'll be underground and stay underground for 5, 6, 7 years at a time before they come back out. It takes a nice heavy rain for them to come back out. Yeah, so mammal burrows work well for this as well. This is a ringneck snake. Ringneck snakes, they don't like it hot and dry. They're around here. You can find them under rocks around here. You can find them in a few different places. They like it moist. So if you find a nice kind of woodland edge place where there's a little bit of sun but still a little bit of moisture, you might be able to find a few. But on a hot summer day, these guys are 3 to 4 feet underground, but they follow the worms. Wherever the worms go, you're gonna find the ringneck snakes. That's what they're eating. Anyway, get underground during the summertime when it's too hot. There's a species of turtle that exists in the plains called the yellow mud turtle. You guys have them in eastern Iowa, and we have them in western Nebraska. And for whatever reason, they don't eat in between. Right? They're weird. They like it sandy. They'll come out of hibernation, they'll eat, they'll do their thing. And then females will crawl up into dry hillsides during the heat of the summer. They will dig a burrow, or a hole, a nest, so to speak. They'll get about 1.5 feet underground. They'll lay their eggs, and then they'll just stay there with their eggs. They're just like, oh, I'm gonna hang out with the kids till they hatch. And then when the eggs hatch, they dig themselves up and they leave. They don't take care of their kids. Right, like my mom. I'm just kidding. She's a great mom. Sometimes. All right. Some other adaptations to living on the plains. Yeah, we get lots of floods, but it doesn't affect these guys, unless it's the wrong time of year, but they just swim. All snakes can swim. Some are better at it than others, like water snakes. But all snakes have the ability to move through the water. This is a bull snake up here, swimming across the lake. And this is a timber rattlesnake, also swimming across the lake. When they need to escape, when they need to move to a new place, when it floods. When the floods came to Texas, I don't remember what it was 2, 3 years ago? There were articles in their newspapers talking about how there were thousands of snakes that were showing up as a result of these floods. Because the floods happened to come early in the spring, or late winter, and these snakes were all hibernating, and they had no choice because their hibernation macula were all flooded. So thousands of snakes made their way to the surface and had no place to go. So they just swam, and they swam, and they swam, until they found dry ground. And some of them are able to climb. You've seen snakes in trees?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all pretty good climbers, right? Again, try doing that without arms and legs. Try to climb a tree without arms and legs. You've got to have respect for a little bit of this stuff. This is a cottonmouth. This is a moccasin that's up in a little redwood tree. But these are all what we call black rat snakes or western rat snakes. They're common in the southeast part of Iowa, southwest part of Iowa, the southeast part of Nebraska, and then farther south from there. And they can climb. Like, it doesn't matter the kind of tree. They can climb walls. Look at the brick wall. Look at this thing. That's crazy. It puts its belly scales into these bricks and it widens them. The reason that they could do that is because, again, over evolutionary time, their body shape has changed so that instead of being round, like if you were to cut a snake in half, I don't recommend doing this at home, but if you were to cut a snake in half, you would see that the snake is round. But if you cut a rat snake in half like this, you would see that only the top part is round and the bottom part is flat, like a piece of bread. And that flat part has corners on either side that allow them to wedge themselves onto trees, in between bricks, and wherever they want. And look, they eat robin eggs. Oh, poor little avian reptiles.
Wait, birds are reptiles?
Oh my gosh, you just that.
Yeah. We'll save that discussion for later. We'll talk about why the reptiles later. But anyway, trust me, the birds have more than their fair share of snakes to eat, so everybody loses in this scenario. Some other adaptations that they've, and this is just recent, but I don't know if I want to call it an adaptation. I guess in some cases it would be. We have changed the landscape, obviously. We've put corn, beans, wheat, we put all kinds of crops on the landscape. And we've taken what was a lawn of hundreds of different kinds of plants and replaced it with a crop. Well, it turns out snakes don't give a damn. They'll move right across it like it's grassland. They don't care. If for thousands of years snakes have been moving across a prairie and then all of a sudden that prairie becomes a cornfield, they're still going to move across that prairie, except it's going to be corn instead of grass. They don't care. They're not botanists. They can't tell the difference between corn and big blue stem. Doesn't matter to them. This is interesting, and this is something that we just discovered in the past 15 years or 20 years or so in Nebraska. This was by accident. Somebody accidentally set fire to this ditch, this right-of-way. along the roadside, along a blacktop roadside in southeast Nebraska. And when they did so, you see all these little white spots here? Those are all crayfish burrows. So we walked along crayfish burrows and we started finding Massasaugas, little rattlesnakes. And it turns out that if you destroy their hibernaculum, like their wet grasslands where they would normally hide and spend the winters with their crayfish, the crayfish are like, I'm just gonna move. And they move to the ditches. The ditches hold water. The crayfish dig holes, the snakes go into the crayfish holes. And so now we have a dozen or so different places in southeast Nebraska where we know that they're using roadside ditches to hibernate and to reproduce and to give birth, right? Their babies are all being born there. We find babies there every fall. Weird. And then they also use them as their migratory pathways because it has food. So they'll continuously move along these roadways rather than moving across the street. Like this stupid snake is going to get run over. All right, what else we got here? So to protect themselves from predation, snakes on the plains have adapted a pattern that is continuous and consistent throughout the entire plains. That picture up there has the dorsal patterns of 8 different species of snakes, but they all look similar, right? I get a lot of calls and I talk to a lot of people who tell me that they've seen a moccasin or a rattlesnake or something, and then they describe it. Well, it had these patches all over its back, and I'm like, okay, so there are at least 14 or 15 different snakes that have that pattern. So, and one of these is a rattlesnake, right? You know which one is the rattlesnake up here?
The first one.
This one?
Yeah.
Nope, that's a water snake.
3. Third one.
Number 3, the fat one, the wide-bodied one, right? So I should have made that skinnier in the picture. So but they all have a very similar pattern. And the other way is to just run away, run away, run away. They don't call these things racers for no reason whatsoever. They can escape predation. They move really fast through the grass, really fast across roads. There are coach whips that do the same thing. So in essence, if you don't have the camouflage to hide yourself in the grass, which is what all of these snakes are able to do up here, then you run. And so the other snakes either have no pattern, like this one here, and it just moves fast through the grass, it's the same color as the grass, or they have a stripe down their back, and that stripe confuses the predators, because predators are like following the stripe, and then the stripe is gone. Then they see it again, and then it's gone again. Right? So there are a few exceptions to this, like milk snakes. Right? You can have a milk snake. That we'll see later. Milk snakes are supposed to be coral snake mimics. We'll see why a little later. All right. Adaptations to disease. And you might think, oh, what are the snake diseases and frog diseases? There are lots of frog diseases that are popping up recently. In fact, there is a whole section of herpetology now that is dedicated to herpetological diseases. Fungi, which weren't here before but are here now. In this case, this is a fungus that has been infecting snakes, and it started, the first ones were found over here in Ohio, and then they found them here, and then they found them here, and then they found them in New England, and they started wiping out populations of Massasauga rattlesnakes and timber rattlesnakes and water snakes and other kinds of species of snakes. We find them here in Nebraska, well, Iowa and Nebraska. In fact, we found a prairie rattlesnake with one, back in 2000, 2001? And the snake actually died from it. But most of the time, they survive. They're not like these guys who can't handle it. Our snakes in the plains have dealt with this already. This disease has made its way through the plains. It has wiped out those that can't handle it and allowed those that can to stick around. So we see snakes come out of hibernation with a few fungi spots on their bodies. They shed, and then they're fine. But these guys here, the ones in the east and in the Midwest, they can't handle it. Right? Just like a snowstorm. They just don't know how to handle it. Should be in the news. Snakes with snake fungal disease. And it's the same way with, there's an amphibian disease called chytrid fungus, Chytridiomycosis. It's like that, it's a really long word that only scientists can say, and only fungal scientists can say. So there's an amphibian disease that is doing the same thing, and it's wiping out populations of amphibians, but not in the Great Plains, not in the plains at all. We find the disease, our bullfrogs here are immune to it. Like, they could carry it around and they're not affected by it at all. Because they've had it, and all of the ones who couldn't handle it have died, and all the ones that can handle it are still around. So what do you get for being the best of the best? Well, hopefully respect. But more importantly, when the climate starts to change even more so than it's changing now, survival. Whatever's coming in terms of climate change, the Great Plains has already been through it, either in this year or over a couple of years. Like, we have had extremely hot temperatures when we shouldn't have. We've had extremely cold temperatures when we shouldn't have. We have had strong rains when we shouldn't have, and we've had drought when we shouldn't have. Everything here that still exists in the grasslands has survived all of this. But these guys, well, I don't have a map anymore. In the east and to the west of us, where they're going to have change, they don't know how to cope with that change. And that change is going to come so fast that they're probably going to lose populations. But climate change here in the plains, as miserable as it's probably going to be for us, most of these animals are probably going to survive it. Very few exceptions, but most of these animals will still be here in 50 years or so when we have Texas temperatures up here in Dakotas and in Iowa. Because that's what's coming. If we stay on the same track we're on now, this is the best case scenario, this is the worst case scenario, right? This means that the temperatures here are going to increase anywhere from 5 to 7 degrees. Here they're going to increase anywhere from 8 to more than 10 degrees, depending on how much more CO2 is spilled out into the atmosphere and how much more heat is retained at the Earth's surface. But your bull snakes will be fine. You'll still be able to go out and play with bull snakes. They'll figure out a way. I think. I hope. I won't be here, so I need somebody to watch them. Anyway, in the end, what it comes down to is survival and fitness and reproduction. And Darwin or Wallace or Kelly Clarkson got it right. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And the species that exist here in the plains are stronger for it. They're stronger for having to go through everything that the East and the West is going to be going through over the next 40 to 50 years. And I think that's all I got. Right? We have some snakes for you to look at and potentially hold. I have